Hello everyone, welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most interstellar podcast in the world. As always, we are your hosts, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And we're out here with the first worst to best of the year. It's last one we did was back in November, I believe, if I'm correct on that. And
I believe it was November, yeah.
it was on Blink 182, I think, as well. So it's been a while, but we're back in full swing. We're back in the full swing of things. And we're ready to kick off the year with a massive discography, to say the least. And this one is a pretty special one because this artist left us about 5 years ago. And the anniversary of this artist's death only happened a few weeks ago. So we thought that it would be a great idea to do this episode, and it's probably the only opportunity we'll ever get to do this kind of an episode with this long of a discography. But that artist in particular is the legendary David Bowie. And I'm very excited to do this, because since I did my video on David Bowie, Bowie's slowly become one of my favorite artists of all time. And I'm excited. It's been a tough list for me to decide, because I love a lot of Bowie albums, but then I'm indifferent towards a lot of them.
Yeah, no, I don't think I've any really controversial picks. I think most of my unpopular opinions are going to be more on the positive side of things, as in I'm going to rank some spicy albums higher up than most people would. So,
I'm excited to see that. I'm excited for that one. And yeah, we'll just get right into it. We'll just quit waffling. We'll get right into that. Starting at number 24. In my opinion, David Bowie's worst album is Never Let Me Down.
My number 24 pick is Tonight.
Alright, not too controversial. Nice one.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my opinion, Never Let Me Down is Bowie's worst album, and the title is misleading, as this is a massive letdown. Never Let Me Down is just generic, bland, uninteresting, half-assed, and cookie-cutter. It sounds dated, it's cheesy in all honesty, and it's sort of unlistenable in a sense too, because the production isn't that great here. It feels like a vapid mess that shouldn't really exist. You know, sonically it may be fine on the surface, but it's just mediocre. Bowie doesn't really give it his all. Every single track on this album is just forgettable, doesn't really have much in the way of anything stand out, and every track just sounds exactly the same to me. You know, that might just be because it's unmemorable, but I have no other reason to remember much from it.
Yeah, I went with Tonight, which is a bit of a similar pick, kind of same era of Bowie. And while it isn't the first accessible David Bowie album, it sure is a bit of a turning point in his career for me, as it feels like the first time, and pretty much the only real time it ever seems like he's just kind of phoning it in. He's not really trying anything exciting, anything creative. He's just making some very generic, new wavy pop rock pastiche. There's little about this album that stands out. The reggae-infused sound also just doesn't really complement Bowie's style all that much, in my opinion. There's times where it just doesn't really click at all. There are one or two tracks that stand out to me as downright awful. Like, the whole album isn't bad, but it's just definitely the least inspired David Bowie album, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think Bowie himself described like that era of his music as his Phil Collins era. And at least he was self-aware about it. Yeah, I think the best track from Never Let Me Down is Day In, Day Out, and I don't have a least favorite because I don't remember any songs from this album.
Well, my favorite track on Tonight was Loving the Alien. My least favorite tracks were Tonight and Dancing with the Big Boys.
Okay, moving on to our number 23 spot, I chose David Bowie's self-titled album.
I chose Never Let Me Down.
David Bowie's self-titled isn't the best start for Bowie's discography, to say the least. I don't think it's a terrible record by any means, but it just isn't that interesting. It's fairly inoffensive psych pop and baroque pop that has some charm in the way that Bowie writes his tracks, but none of these songs are memorable, and some of the songwriting is just completely fucking stupid, like on Sell Me a Coat. Instrumentally, it doesn't have any interesting ideas. A lot of it is pretty trite, to be honest, and there isn't really that many tracks on here that are good, maybe except for one, which I'll get to. You know, vocally, Bowie isn't there yet either. He's just whatever on here. You know, the silver lining for this album is that it's short, and if you were to get into Bowie, I'd say this is skippable. It's only really necessary if you're, like, a huge David Bowie fan.
Yeah, I chose Never Let Me Down, and similarly to Tonight, Never Let Me Down is just David Bowie kind of phoning it in and nothing else. It's just, you know, very inoffensive, adult-oriented rock from one of the most creative and forward-thinking artists of all time, and this album just doesn't really showcase any of that. You know, as with the last album, it's not downright bad, it's not awful, but, you know, you just expect more from Bowie. It's just a bit of a slow point in his career, and it's definitely not one of the most exciting albums he's released, not even close.
Alright, my favourite track from David Bowie is When I Live My Dream. My least favourite tracks are Sell Me a Coat, Rubber Band, and We Are Hungry Men.
My favourite tracks on Never Let Me Down were Time Will Crawl, and my least favourite was my least favourites were 87 and Cry and Bang Bang.
Okay, for my number 22 spot, I am going with Tonight.
For my number 22 spot, I'm going with the first self-titled debut.
Alright, we got all the same ones out so far, alright. Yeah, and it's for a reason. These albums aren't that interesting, and yeah, Tonight, you know, it continues like the new wave route that Bowie was toying with on Let's Dance, and he creates an album that's just, you know, it's monotonous, it's forgettable. Bowie's clearly phoning it in, and, you know, he clearly, and I believe he knew that this album just wasn't great. He made it just so he could capitalize on Let's Dance. I think he admitted that. And, for its 40-minute runtime, it feels kind of longer as well. Like, to say something positive, the tracks, like, they aren't that bad. There's a couple of decent tracks, and the production has some cool moments, I guess. Especially when the tracks become a lot more explosive, or when there's just great bass lines, guitar licks, and sax playing. But other than that, there's just nothing else that really makes them stand out to me. They're just bland, generic. You know, some of these tracks, you know, they get very repetitive. They drag on for way too long. The shorter songs, more specifically on the back end, feel so vapid and thrown together. There's just some why did you do this moments in the track list too. There's not really much else I could say about it. It's just one of his weaker albums. There's not much else to add to that.
Yeah, I went with his debut self-titled album, which is far from the worst thing ever, but its biggest issue is just how uninteresting and inoffensive it is. A lot of the tracks are just so bland and deprived of anything really unique for the time that it borders on novelty. It does kind of remind me of a lot of Pink Floyd's early work, but completely stripped of any of the psychedelic undertones and impressive instrumentation that makes those albums so interesting and enthralling. It overall just doesn't really have the grandiose or glamorous nature that Bowie would go on to, you know, showcase in a lot of his better albums, and instead it just comes off as quite goofy and cartoonish.
Fun Bowie fact, this album came out the same day that Sgt. Pepper's came out.
Oh.
Yeah, I think
There's
so.
a bit of a difference in terms of quality there, but hey.
Yeah. I just thought I'd throw that out there. Anyways, it was Tonight I was talking about. Yeah, my favourite tracks from Tonight are Blue Jean, Neighborhood Threat, and Loving the Alien. My least favourite tracks are Tumble and Twirl, and I Keep Forgetting.
My favourite tracks on the self-titled debut were Rubber Band, Love You Till Tuesday. My least favourite tracks were There's a Happy Land, We Are Hungry Men, and Mr. Gravedigger.
Alright, for my number 21 pick, I chose Black Tie White Noise.
I also chose Black Tie White Noise.
Yes. Yeah, Black Tie White Noise is just one of the more drab and forgettable moments in Bowie's discography, as it just doesn't have much about it that's remarkable. I will give Black Tie White Noise some credit where it's due, as this album shows that Bowie is still capable of putting together some fun tunes, but at the same time, it latches onto a lot of 90s dance pop tropes and pastiche while adding nothing interesting on top of them. Bowie is practically catatonic throughout this whole album. There's only a few moments where he shines, but besides that, he doesn't really seem like he's giving it his all. The production is fine for the most part. It does a great job at creating a fun atmosphere, and it has some great moments, but after a while, it got very stale and very predictable. Bowie just really didn't give much life to them, except on a couple of tracks. The great tracks are few and far in between, as most of this just blends into each other, and it gets pretty forgettable. This album, it's nearly an hour long. Like, some of Bowie's best work is like 30 to 40 minutes. I would have preferred it stay that way, as the tracks on here just don't stay engaging for nearly an hour length, and they just drift away from my focus and drag on for way too long.
This is a bit of a turning point in my rankings, as in every album after here is a 6 or above for me personally. So these are albums that I do enjoy to varying degrees. Black Tie White Noise is pleasant. I do think the very jazzy, sophisti-pop aesthetic does work well with Bowie's demeanor and his baritone vocals. It's just the biggest problem this album has is it's very, very, very bloated. As you said, a lot of his finer albums are quite concise, or quite short, or quite easy to consume. This one is just very slow burning. It doesn't really do enough in its track listing to kind of justify a lot of the tracks that were included here. A lot of the tracks just kind of sound way too similar to one another. They give off the same energy, and in the grand scheme of things, this just isn't an album I'll be returning to very often at all, especially when it comes to the grand scheme of his discography, where there's classic after classic after classic. This one just kind of gets lost, and for good reason, to be honest.
Yeah. My favourite tracks from Black Tie White Noise are the title track, You've Been Around, and Don't Let Me Down and Down. My least favourite tracks were Miracle Goodnight, Palace Athen, and The Wedding Song.
My favourite tracks were Palace Athena, Miracle Goodnight, and Looking for Lester. My least favourite track was I Feel Free.
Alright, for my number 20 spot, I have chosen Hours.
I chose Young Americans.
Ooh, that low, really? Oh. That's a bit of a hot take. Well, somewhat.
A tiny hot take.
Tiny. I suppose most Bowie fans wouldn't have it like that low.
Yeah, I'm also sure no one is going to be foaming at the mouth over that one.
Yeah, I'm not even foaming. I'm just kind of surprised. Yeah, Hours, I don't really have a whole lot to say about Hours. It isn't that remarkable as well. To give some praise, I like a lot of the writing on some of these tracks, particularly on Thursday's Child and Survive. They seem to come from a more melancholic state of mind, and it's written well in my opinion. But besides that, this album is, for lack of better words, just straight up boring. Like, the production is just, it's uninspired. I feel like too much is going on. It's kind of airy, a bit too airy. Bowie's performances are sometimes good, but mostly unmemorable, and just the songs just blend into it together. The only thing that's remarkable about this album for me is that it's tied in with a video game, but I don't know which one it is. It was like a soundtrack to it for some reason, but I can't remember what the game is called. But I just found that fascinating, unlike this album, because it's not that fascinating. I mean, I'd say you could just skip this if you're going through Bowie's discog for the first time, because it's fairly inessential in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think Young Americans is bad. It just really isn't the most interesting album he's released, especially given the era that it was released in. It was a pretty notorious part of Bowie's career where he would release a lot of classics. But the whole direction this album took, while obviously not without potential, as it would go on to be more refined and just more grandiose, even a year later on a specific album that I've definitely ranked higher that I will talk about soon. It just feels a little half-baked here. It feels like it just a little refining needed to go into this album, and it did on station to station. I'll just mention it so I don't sound like I'm but yeah, it's not that interesting in the grand scheme of things. It has some great tracks, but the track listing just doesn't really shine as much as it does on some of his other albums, especially in the 70s. and the good moments are kind of brought down by some less interesting moments, in my opinion.
All right. My favorite tracks from Hours are Thursday's Child, Survive, If I'm Dreaming My Life, and 7. My least favorite track is The Dreamers.
My favorite tracks were Young Americans and Fame. My least favorite track was Across the Universe.
All right. At number 19, I chose Reality.
I chose Hours.
Hey. Okay, Reality is only remarkable because it has Anime Bowie on it. Need I say more? Reality is a fine album that has its fair share of brilliant and good tracks, but, it's only going to be remembered for having that album cover. It has some pretty interesting lyrical moments on it, some really nice production moments and ideas, but as a whole, it's not that great. Some of the production can come off a little too dated. Many of the tracks here are pretty forgettable and pretty boring. It's not very remarkable in the grander scheme of Bowie's discog, and it doesn't really warrant that much replay value at all. It has amazing tracks. I think the first 4 tracks are fantastic, but and it is a diverse track list too, but I've nothing else to say besides that.
I chose Hours, and Hours is one of many moments in Bowie's career where he kind of adapts his sound to what was going on around him in the music scene. And on this album, he takes a dive into alternative rock. And overall, it's fine. It's executed decently. And it does have its fair share of great tracks, but it just feels to me like a display of a lot of 90s alt-rock tropes without really anything unique or creative or really Bowie about it. It just feels like if this was released by any other artist, it would have completely been forgotten. But just because it's Bowie, it's kind of remains somewhat relevant. And just overall, it doesn't really have that David Bowie magic to it that a lot of albums do. It just kind of gets lost behind the alt-rock instrumentation. But that being said, there are some great tracks on here that I actually have come back to quite a bit.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Reality are The Loneliest Guy, Never Get Old, Nuclear Star, and Pablo Picasso. My least favourite track is She'll Drive My Big Car and Days.
My favourite tracks on Hours were Thursday's Child, 7, The Pretty Things Are Going to Hell. My least favourite tracks were Something in the Air and New Angels of Promise.
Alright, for my number 18 pick, I chose Let's Dance.
My number 18 was the second self-titled, Space Oddity.
Yeah, Let's Dance. This is David Bowie's widest selling album, and it's an album that saw him attempt to make, a more dance pop and new wave album that appealed more to the masses, which is kind of ironic because he criticized new wave on the album that preceded this, which, I don't know. With production from Nile Rodgers, Bowie makes a fun dance pop album that's pretty enjoyable for what it is, and it has its standout moments, which I'll get to. It sounds pretty good production-wise, it has some nice instrumentals, it has some decent and exciting performances from Bowie, and the first 3 tracks are legitimately great, especially the title track, which is one of his funnest songs, and I think Mike the Snare, described it well. I think it's an aged product of its time. Not even aged. I mean, it's hard to... I can't even remember what he said, but it was something about this aging kind of well, even though being from the 80s.
Yeah.
My issues with Let's Dance, though, resides in the track list and its memorability. The tracks after the first 3 are very unmemorable, in my opinion. They don't really have much about them that makes them unique or stand out in Bowie's catalogue. Or to the other great tracks in the album. These tracks lack either good performances or interesting instrumentals, and they often drag on for way too long, in my opinion.
Yeah, I chose Space Oddity, as it's commonly known as, which is far more ambitious than its predecessor, the first self-titled album. It becomes immediately apparent when you hear the opening track, which is obviously iconic. And unfortunately, the rest of the track listing never really lives up to the cathartic joys that track brings me. But overall, it still has some just great tracks. It has some very glamorous moments that kind of hint at what Bowie would go on to produce in his later down the line. and overall is just more akin to what, you know, we now know to be David Bowie. It's still not quite there in terms of reaching potential. It's still, you know, some of the material on here, for lack of a better word, is quite boring, but it is a stepping stone of sorts between the debut and, you know, the iconic albums that he would release in the 70s.
Alright. My favourite tracks from Let's Dance are the title track, Modern Love and China Girl. My least favourite track is Ricochet.
My favourite tracks off Space Oddity were Space Oddity and Letter to Hermione. And my least favourite track was Memory of a Free Festival.
Okay, moving on to the number, is it 18?
17, I think.
Oh, 17. Okay, moving on to my number 17 pick, I chose Space Oddity.
I chose Heathen.
Yeah, Bowie's sophomore album saw him improve immensely upon his debut, and I think that it has a very, very noteworthy track in his discography, obviously. You know what that is. And I also think it's somewhat underrated in Bowie's catalog because it has some great deep cuts, but I wouldn't put it up there with the pedestal of great albums he's already made. You know, in general, I like this album a lot. I think it has plenty of grand and exciting moments. The production and vocals have improved immensely. The instrumentals feel a lot more exciting, grandiose, and bright, which they would hint at with, you know, further releases. The lengthier tracks just ooze, like, excitement, even. You know, the title track often overshadows what's on the rest of the album, but I don't think it should be considered just, oh, the album that's just titled and has Space Oddity, because there's more to it, and I think there's more noteworthy tracks. You know, the album isn't perfect, however, it's a tad bit repetitive sound-wise. The songwriting has its decent and poetic moments, but it's still not all that great, and some of the tracks just feel a bit underwhelming when compared to the standouts. Besides that, I think that it has some essential and underrated Bowie cuts, but it doesn't stand a chance against some of Bowie's best.
Yeah, I went with Heathen, and after a long series of albums spanning several decades where David Bowie would experiment and try new things stylistically with his music, Heathen feels like Bowie, you know, finally coming back and just playing to his strengths and returning to like a very pure art rock style that he's proven time and time again that he's very capable of, and you know, it really works. This album is for the most part quite good. It's quite familiar. Even before I heard it, this whole album just sounded very familiar to me. It is a very David Bowie-esque album. But I do have to admit that the track listing is, again, a bit bloated. You know, with tracks that don't really feel properly carved out and executed. And those tracks do kind of feel a little bare bones and do bring the album down a little bit, although still the great moments are here and they're worth staying for.
Okay. My favourite tracks from Space Oddity are the title track, Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed, and Wild Eyed Boy from Free Cloud. My least favourite tracks are Janine and God Knows I'm Good.
My favourite tracks on Heathen were Sunday, Afraid, 5:15, The Angels Have Gone, and Heathen. My least favourite tracks were I've Been Waiting for You and A Better Future.
Okay, for my number 16 pick, I chose Outside.
For my number 16 pick, I chose Reality.
Alright. Outside to me is one of Bowie's more somewhat underrated albums. It's not perfect, however. It barely stands up to the best in his discog, but it has its moments, and it saw Brian Eno work with him once more, and I believe it would be the last time that he would work with Brian Eno as well. Outside sees David Bowie return to form by substituting the bland and uninteresting dance pop and new wave sounds of his output prior, and instead strives to making, an art rock album with some thematic cohesion, but like kind of resembling some of his 70s work. Outside combines like some of the elements that we've seen in the Berlin trilogy and adds like kind of an industrial twist to it, which could have been inspired by Trent Reznor, but you never know. It has some interesting atmospheres that it explores, and it's sonically interesting most of the time. Not all the tracks land with me, unfortunately, because the instrumentals are either lackluster or Bowie himself is lackluster. Some of the story being told isn't really all that fleshed out either, and it's pretty long considering it's 74 minutes. I think Bowie's vocals are pretty good in this album for the most part. They seem a bit aged, and honestly, I think Bowie still has it this time around, and they match the dark instrumentals, I think there's some great Bowie deep cuts in here, and those are noteworthy in his discography, in my opinion.
Yeah, I went with anime album. This album, honestly, is for the most part, to me personally, kind of interchangeable with Heathens. I enjoy them both pretty much equally, and for a lot of the same reasons. They both seem like very familiar albums where Bowie's just kind of playing to his strengths. He's not really doing anything new or unique, but he's doing what Bowie's known for. And the reason I do have Reality higher than Heathen is I just feel like there's a bit more quality in some of the finer moments on this album. For example, the first 2 tracks are fantastic. The album does, again, kind of slow down and feel a bit bare or just undercooked at times, but overall it's still a good album, and there's still plenty of moments to come back to.
Do you think he'd be the antagonist or the protagonist in the anime?
Bowie? I think he'd be both.
Yeah.
I think he'd literally be 2 different characters.
Actually, he could be multiple characters. That makes sense, actually. Okay, my favorite tracks from Outside are The Motel, The Voyeur of Utter Destruction, Wishful Beginnings, We Prick You, I'm Deranged, Through These Architects' Eyes, and Strangers When We Meet. My least favorite tracks are The Heart's Filthy Lesson, Hallow Space Boy, and A Small Plot of Land.
My favorite tracks on Reality were Nuclear Star, Pablo Picasso, and Try Some Buy Some. My least favorite track was She'll Drive That Big Car. The Big Car, sorry.
Okay. For 15, I chose Earthling.
I chose The Man Who Sold the World.
Earthling saw Bowie go into like a new sound with influences that stem heavily from drum and bass, with a crossover with some art rock songs, and in my opinion, this album's pretty good. Despite me liking this album, it isn't perfect. I don't think Bowie is performing to the best of his ability. He sounds half asleep for most of these tracks, and a lot of the tracks on this album are a bit too self-indulgent for my liking. But besides that, I like a lot of things about this album. I think that the production is really good for the most part. The sound is really aggressive and explosive, and it combines well with the break beats and in this album. Plus, the atmospheres are pretty intricate and detailed, and I love listening to them. The 9 tracks on here are relatively exciting, and it has plenty of highlights to take away from it. But ultimately, it doesn't really warrant a lot of replay value for me, personally. Also, I can always appreciate a Trent Reznor appearance, which he did on the track Afraid of Americans.
Yeah, I went with The Man Who Sold the World, Bowie's 3rd album. And it's evident at this point that Bowie was really trying to expand and, create something new with the sound. It definitely, out of his first 3 albums, is by far the most ambitious through and through, from start to finish. And it's really evident here that he's starting to find his footing. It's a more rock-oriented effort than his first 2 albums, and a lot of the tracks even, incorporate hard rock riffing, as well as some psychedelic rock aspects. And it's a really fun, really energetic album. It's quite playful. It's very enjoyable through and through. But aside from the title track, it doesn't really contain any material that is really worthy of being, in a conversation for some of his best songs, some of his best works. It's a good album, but it doesn't really live up to the great things that he would achieve.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Earthling are Afraid of Americans, Dead Man Walking, and 7 Years in Tibet. My least favourite track is The Last Thing You Should Do.
My favourite tracks on The Man Who Sold the World were All the Madmen, Black Country Rock, After All, She Shook Me Cold, and The Man Who Sold the World. My least favourite track was The Superman.
Okay, my number 14 pick is Heathen.
My number 14 pick is Earthling.
To me, Heathen is probably one of Bowie's more underrated albums, and I know I've said that like 3 times, but I don't care. It is a pretty good outing, all in all, when you take his 90s output into consideration. Production-wise, it has plenty of great stellar mixes and refined art rock songs that have that Tony Visconti flair to them, which I think Tony and David Bowie had a falling out over Let's Dance, because that's when he switched to Nile Rodgers and Tony disagreed with him. So they made up and they made this album, and that's why it has that familiar feel. It has that that Tony Visconti flair. And fair play to him, he makes this album good to me. It has some melancholic atmospheres which work well with a lot of Bowie's mature and introspective writing. Bowie gives us some great performances too, and with all that in mind, we get some pretty great deep cuts from this project. However, it isn't perfect. Some tracks are way too redundant and way too uninteresting, specifically after the first 5 tracks, which I thought was a great run of songs, and it's all because either Bowie's performances were okay or the production was okay. There's a bad song in this album to me, but it's clear which tracks are the weakest ones, but there's some great gems to be found in this one for me.
Yeah, I went with Earthling, which is perhaps one of the most left field and bizarre albums in Bowie's whole discography. It's a very eclectic blend of art rock and genres you would never really typically expect from Bowie. Alternative dance, drum and bass, a bit of industrial rock. It's surprising. It was surprising for me the first time I heard this, but you know what? It works quite well. Everything is executed quite seamlessly, and Bowie just sounds natural over a lot of these really bizarre and wacky instrumentals. There are moments that feel a little undercooked and even sometimes a bit forced, but there's really a lot of quality tracks on here and a lot of new and unique ideas in his discography. It's definitely a one-of-a-kind album when it comes to the grand scheme of his discography, and it's pretty damn good.
I agree. Alright, so my favourite tracks from Heathen are Sunday, Afraid, Cactus, Slip Away, Slow Burn, and 5.15, The Angels Have Gone. And my least favourite track is Everyone Says Hi.
My favourite tracks on Earthling were Little Wonder, 7 Years in Tibet, and I'm Afraid of Americans. My least favourite track was Battle for Britain.
Alright, my number 13 pick is Young Americans.
My number 13 pick is Aladdin Sane.
Oh, that is a hot take.
Every single album at this point is really good, so something has to be a hot take, quote unquote.
I mean, most people would put Aladdin Sane in the top 10, but damn.
I mean, Jesus. I think every album past this point is a 7 or above.
Yeah, I'm in the 7s too. I'm nearly at the 8s actually, but damn. I would put Aladdin Sane much higher, which you will find out.
It's not that spicy of a take, and given that I am kind of giving some albums a little more of the limelight than they usually get.
Alright, fine, I guess.
It's not that spicy, trust me. I really like this song.
I mean, I think putting it at 13 is spicy, but
Yeah,
I chose Young Americans, and it was the first thing that Bowie came out with after the end of his glam rock era, and it saw him embrace the sounds of pop soul while, incorporating some other kind of sounds too. And while I think that Young Americans is a good album, it isn't an album that I return to regularly, and I feel like it doesn't really stand a chance against a lot of the absolute best stuff in Bowie's discography. Bowie's take on Plastic Soul isn't really that creative, and Bowie doesn't really add his own spin on things. It just reads as Bowie just doing soul pastiche, and for the most part, it's just serviceable. It has some fantastic highlights, but it also has some forgettable and somewhat sloppy tracks. There's some great instrumentation here. When it comes to the horns and the brass work, I think it's great, but some of it is a bit too clean for my liking. Bowie's pretty good vocally on here. He felt comfortable in this new direction, and he fit these instrumentals well, but his songwriting wasn't all that great in my opinion, which is an element that drags it down, but I feel like, the sound makes up for it. And another Bowie fun fact, John Lennon helped him write Fame.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. I have my knee up to death. That's how interested I was in that fact.
Wow.
Yeah, I went with Aladdin Sane, which is a very good album. And it's a very good representation of the glam rock era of Bowie. And its finest moments are some of the most interesting and wonderful tracks in his whole discography. The only thing that brings it down a little bit for me is that there are some tracks on here that just kind of seem like just really by the numbers glam rock. It's something that he's already shown time and time again that he can make a very good glam rock song. And some of the tracks on here don't really do anything new or anything that progresses that sound further. It just kind of seems like it's stuck in a loop of just making glam rock, glam rock, glam rock. There's nothing really new about some of the tracks, but that being said, the moments that are really stand out to me and that are my favorite moments on this album are among the best in his discography. It's got some fantastic moments.
Okay, my favorite tracks from Young Americans are Win, Somebody Up There Likes Me, and Can You Hear Me? My least favorite track is Right.
My favorite tracks on Aladdin Sane were Watch That Man, Panic in Detroit, Time, and Lady Grinning Soul. My least favorite track was Let's Spend the Night Together. Jesus, I keep hitting the desk.
Okay, for my number...
bangs.
We're at the top half of the list now.
Oh, and, yeah, you're right.
We're at the top half of the list, woo!
Woo!
My number 12 pick is The Man Who Sold the World.
My number 12 pick is Scary Monsters and Super Creeps.
Alright. Bowie's third album is very good stepping stone for him after that, what was considered a rough start to his career with his first two albums. The Man Who Sold the World is the first instance of Bowie going for a fully rock sound with more jammy production, and the songwriting tackles a lot more dark themes with a more vivid approach, and it hints at what he could be capable of not too soon afterward, actually. The production end of things is very good. The guitar work is fantastic, especially on the first three tracks. I love how heavy it gets. It goes into kind of a hard rock song, and I like those heavy guitar, like the heavy tones. And I think his vocals sound great on here too. A definite improvement from his first two records. And it's not perfect. There's a couple of tracks on here that underwhelmed me a bit, whether that be because of the production or the song structures. But besides that, I like a lot of the tracks from this one in particular. But since there's so much more Bowie had to offer, this is just kind of rendered a little obsolete in his discography. But I think it's good. I think it's pretty good.
I went with Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. David Bowie's first album in the 80s, being a full-on kind of dive into new wave, is quite a suitable way to start the 80s off. It's got some incredible tracks, especially the first few on this thing are very memorable, very creative, and a kind of a breath of fresh air after a series of kind of similar sounding albums. I'm after scrolling up in my notes, I apologize. The album has got some incredible tracks, and while some of the tracks just don't really match the quality of a lot of its finer moments, it never is downright bad or downright not enjoyable. It's just consistently at least decent. Albums that I've ranked higher up, specifically there's a new wave album that I have ranked a bit higher, I think execute the sound a bit better, or just a bit of a more complete package in my opinion. Although the trilogy of tracks in Ashes to Ashes, Fashion, and Teenage Wildlife are incredible. One of the best moments in his discography, as well as the start to this album. It starts off really strong. So yeah, this album has some absolute standouts, but in the grand scheme of things, not really his best work.
Alright, my favourite tracks from The Man Who Sold the World are The Width of a Circle, All the Madmen, Black Country Rock, Run and Gun Blues, and The Man Who Sold the World. My least favourite tracks are After All and She Shook Me Cold.
My favourite tracks on Scary Monsters were It's No Game Part 1, Up the Hill, Backwards, Ashes to Ashes, Fashion, and Teenage Wildlife. My least favourite track was Scream Like a Baby.
My number 11 pick goes to Diamond Dogs.
My number 11 pick goes to Outside.
Alright, Diamond Dogs is the final album in David Bowie's glam rock era, and while I think it's a pretty good album, it isn't as great as some of its predecessors, and that mostly comes down to the album's memorability or any lack of consistently invigorating highs. And I mean predecessors as in his previous glam rock albums. Diamond Dogs has this kind of apocalyptic feel to it, and it sounds good for its duration, and I like the ideas he explores, but some of them just feel conceptually and musically off to me. Maybe they're not as interesting as they should be. The character for this album, Halloween Jack, is probably one of Bowie's most uninteresting characters, in my opinion. With all that said, there are plenty of great things I enjoy about Diamond Dogs. For one, I love the production. It's very lively, theatrical, dramatic, and overall just fun as hell. It has some fantastic highs and catchy moments. Come on, the chorus for 1984, oh, it's so good. And, I think the medley from Sweet Thing to Rebel Rebel is really class too. Bowie's performances are on point, and he brings some electricity to the best tracks on here. There's plenty of good tracks, but overall, I think it's great. I'm not great, good, but I wouldn't say it's his best.
Yeah, I went with Outside, and after a series of fairly uninspired and poorly executed attempts from David Bowie, Outside is really a breath of fresh air. It's an album that is certainly very creative and an overall welcome and surprising new direction from Bowie. A lot of this album is very heavily inspired by industrial rock, and rather surprisingly, the style is pretty well executed by Bowie. He definitely does it justice while still making, the sound of this album very much, operatic and glamorous and just David Bowie-esque through and through. It's a plethora of great tracks. It's really, it has some weaker tracks, but overall it doesn't really slow down. It keeps up the same energy and pacing through and through, and it just keeps it exciting through and through. And overall, I think it's a pretty underrated album.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Diamond Dogs are the title track, Rock and Roll With Me, 1984, and Big Brother. My least favourite track is Chant of the Ever-Circling Skeletal Family.
My favourite tracks on Outside were Outside, The Heart's Filthy Lesson, A Small Plot of Land, Hello Space Boy, The Voyeur of Utter Destruction, We Prick You, and I'm Deranged. My least favourite tracks were I Have Not Been to Oxford Town and Wishful Beginnings.
We have made it to the top 10.
Woohoo!
And my number 10 pick goes to Lodger.
My number 10 pick goes to Let's Dance.
Ooh. Okay. So, David Bowie, wraps up this album, with, what's does my notes even say? Shit. That was terrible. Okay, David Bowie raps on this album. That's what I meant to say. So it's automatically amazing. Nah, to be fair, it's the final album in the Berlin trilogy, and to me, I'd say it's the weakest in the Berlin trilogy, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It's actually really fucking great. It doesn't do what Low and Heroes did, but rather it saw Bowie try to make an album that had a mixture of various other sounds and styles pulled from across the music sphere, and this created a whole concept of just a traveling lodger, just going around to different places, performing different styles, and I think it's cool. It's portrayed, and Bowie himself is portrayed as the lodger in the lyrics, which makes sense given the styles he tries to do, but I think there's some amazing tracks, but I don't think it's overly consistent. I think the album has some pretty cool and experimental moments in its track list. Bowie's putting on quite a show throughout the album. I like how diverse the instrumentation is, and it certainly has its highs, but I feel like it's dragged down by its fair share of tracks that aren't all that great. But with that being said, the highs are amazing and there's lots of them.
Yeah, I went with Let's Dance. And is this album the most accessible thing Bowie had ever done at this point in his career? Yeah. Does that mean it's bad? Nope. Does that mean that there's nothing interesting or creative about this album? Absolutely not. No. Let's Dance has some fantastic tracks, especially the first three. The whole album is definitely a product of its time, but the quality of these tracks is just timeless in my opinion. It's obviously not flawless, and the track Shake It in particular is quite bad in fact, but the highlights on this album aren't exactly scarce, and as a whole it definitely deserves a lot more respect. I love the instrumentation, so funky, so fun. It's just one of the brightest and just most fun albums in his whole discography, and there's just something very just enthralling and ecstatic about this album.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Lodger are Fantastic Voyage, African Night Flight, Move On, DJ, and Boys Keep Swinging. My least favourite track is Repetition.
My favourite tracks on Let's Dance were Modern Love, China Girl, Let's Dance, Without You, Criminal, and Cat People. My least favourite track was Shake It.
My number 9 pick is The Next Day.
My number 9 pick is also The Next Day.
Hey, let's go. This would be Bowie's return after a 10-year hiatus, and I think that The Next Day is a grand return to form for Bowie at this stage. Sound-wise, The Next Day is essentially David Bowie going back to his more beloved, art rock sound from the 70s, which is indicated by the cover, and I feel like he managed to do it well while adding a lot of mature songwriting to it. And the production on this album sounds great as expected. It perfectly recaptured a lot of the previous sounds that he used in the 70s. It may pander a little bit for nostalgia's sake, and some tracks may sound a bit dated. But I think Bowie makes up for it with some great performances and amazing songwriting. Lyrically, Bowie is just looking back on his lengthy career, his personal life, and he ponders over his inevitable death, which will unintentionally foreshadow Black Star. And he manages to keep it interesting with how well written and poetic it is. I feel like his aged vocals add to these themes, and it's like, a way I would describe it is like just an older relative just telling you these stories, and I think it's interesting from that kind of perspective. The album isn't perfect to me though. I feel like it's not completely consistent, but I'll be damned if I didn't say the highs on this album weren't amazing. Like, there's so many brilliant tracks that I have come back to quite often. And yeah, I put it this high because of that.
Yeah, after a decade with no studio album and people probably being terrified that Anime Bowie was going to be the last album he ever releases, the next day, sees Bowie come back with a bang. It's a very sophisticated and yet still very exciting album that has pretty much everything I look for in a good David Bowie release. The compositions are fantastic, the instrumentation is very lively, Bowie's performances are very stern but emotive, and overall it's just a really good project. If I was to nitpick, I would say the album does kind of peak at the start and mellows down with some less memorable tracks near the back end of the project, but thankfully again it does really pick up and end with a bang. Through and through, it's definitely a very good project and a welcome return for Bowie after a 10-year break.
Alright, my favourite tracks from The Next Day are Where Are We Now, The Stars Are Out Tonight, Valentine's Day, Heat, The Next Day, Dirty Boys, Love Is Lost, and Dancing Out in Space. My least favourite track is I'd Rather Be High.
My favourite tracks on The Next Day were The Next Day, The Stars Are Out Tonight, Love Is Lost, Valentine's Day, and Heat. My least favourite track is Boss of Me.
Alright, for my number 8 pick, I chose Scary Monsters and Super Creeps.
For my number 8 pick, I chose Diamond Dogs.
This album to me is like the last great Bowie album before his self-described Phil Collins era. And to me, this album sees Bowie finding a perfect balance between remaining relatively experimental while also being relatively accessible, and I think this album's great as a result. Production-wise, this album is probably the heaviest album in Bowie's catalogue, as the mixes on this thing are quite abrasive for what they are. The intense layers of synthesizers and abrasive guitar work culminate perfectly into this wall of sound, and it's really catchy. The funk influences are really cool on this album. I love how present a lot of the bass lines are. The drums absolutely slap, and Bowie himself is in his element on this album with some incredibly captivating and catchy performances all around. And if I'm correct, I think the guitar work on this album was handled by Robert Fripp of King Crimson. And
I don't know if you're correct.
I think it is. I think it's interesting, and that's just another fun fact for you there. Topically, Bowie is more reflective of the influence that he's had over his tenure as an artist, especially when it came to fashion and the impact he had in the 70s. And to me, this is his way of saying the new decade is shaped by what I did, which is pretty ballsy if he actually meant it in that kind of a way. I may be over-analysing that a bit. He also, criticizes New Wave, which is, ironic considering he literally went and did New Wave, the album after this. But there's plenty of memorable moments in this track list, some incredibly catchy Bowie songs, and I really loved a lot of what I was hearing with consecutive listens.
Yeah, I went with Diamond Dogs, which is in a lot of ways very similar to its predecessor, Aladdin Sane. But to me, this album just feels like a more complete and just more interesting and diverse and vibrant effort. A lot of the tracks on here are, while not really anything really ambitious, are definitely just very interesting and intricate. There's a lot of cool ideas. There is a whole concept to this album, which admittedly the concept is quite loose. I don't really understand what it's supposed to be. But the music is mostly very great though, and tracks like Rebel Rebel in 1984 are absolute highlights in Bowie's entire career. And overall, it feels like a more exciting and more memorable Aladdin Sane for me personally.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Scary Monsters and Super Creeps are Teenage Wildlife, It's No Game #1, the title track, Fashion, and Up the Hill Backwards. My least favourite track is Scream Like a Baby.
My favourite tracks on Diamond Dogs were Diamond Dogs, Sweet Thing, Candidate, Rebel Rebel, Rock and Roll With Me in 1984. My least favourite track was We Are the Dead.
For my number 7 pick, I went with Hunky Dory.
Oh, by the way, for me personally, we're getting into the 8s. And I went with Low.
Just to preface this, we're in the 9s right now for me. Hunky Dory is like a 9.
7 9s.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a tough one for this. Hunky Dory
this was the most brutal part of the rankings.
Literally.
Yeah.
Hunky Dory to me is the first amazing album from Bowie, and that's for a number of reasons. The sound of this album is centered around like a glam folk kind of sound. The production this time is a lot more focused and it focuses on a lot of balladry and a lot of piano-based instrumentation. Some guitar tinged tracks are present too, but it's absolutely gorgeous. There's so many details in the instrumentals that make them catchy as hell and very memorable. Bowie is delivering some of his catchiest material and some of his catchiest hooks and vocal performances, and some of his most iconic and memorable songs too. The highs on this record are incredible, to say the least, whether we're talking about, the grand and existential Life on Mars, the catchy changes, the beautiful yet haunting Quicksand, Song for Bob Dylan, the psychedelic Bewlay Brothers. There's just so many tracks on here that are amazing. The songwriting is just damn near flawless. There's a lot of interesting things that Bowie's written on here. The best thing about them is just how well written they are. Whether we're talking about the complexity of some of these ones, the kind of like outer space kind of vibes of Life on Mars, which obviously I'd say foreshadows Ziggy Stardust. There's just so many songs in here that are incredibly catchy, and I don't really have many complaints. It's just a brilliant like pop rock record that sounds just amazing for its time.
Yeah, I went with Low. And Low being the first of the Berlin trilogy really sees Bowie take a new approach to his sound, a very intricate and much more experimental approach, and one that definitely paid off. Compositionally, a lot of these tracks are incredible, and the fact that, a lot of the material on here is instrumental just adds more emphasis to the fantastic compositions. And when the vocals do kick in, the fact that they are very scarce and oftentimes kind of distant in the mix just makes them that more powerful and attention grabbing. I think this album is paced perfectly as well. I think the compositions just flow one into the other perfectly, and I don't think overall as an album it's perfect, and it's certainly not my favorite in his discography, but it's definitely one of the most interesting and fascinating things he's ever released, and it's overall a fantastic album.
My favourite tracks from Hunky Dory are Changes, Oh You Pretty Things, Life on Mars, Kooks, Fill Your Heart, and Queen Bitch. My least favourite track is Andy Warhol.
My favourite tracks on Low were Speed of Life, Sound and Vision, Be My Wife, and Warszawa. My least favourite track was Weeping Wall.
My number 6 pick is Aladdin Sane.
My number 6 pick is Heroes.
Oh, I love Aladdin Sane. Oh, God. Aladdin Sane came out, literally a year after Ziggy Stardust, and it saw Bowie continue his glam rock era with a crisper, heavier, and more intense atmosphere. The character of Aladdin Sane on this album is just a darker version of Ziggy Stardust, and unlike Ziggy Stardust in the way, I don't really see much of a concept, what Bowie's trying to do on here with the sound, but the aesthetic is just... it's great. Production-wise, Aladdin Sane is fantastic. Aladdin Sane feels a lot more clean, a lot more versatile in its approach, especially since a lot of these tracks have a more heavy and piano-based sound. The guitars are oddly heavy on Watch That Man and Cracked Actor, which I love. I think the tones are amazing. The sound combines, elements of glam rock, art rock, blues, and even jazz, and these leave loads of moments that are extremely catchy and just, for lack of better words, just incredible. Some of my favorite Bowie songs are on this album, and his enigmatic presence and his catchy lines are just great, to say the least. I suppose the only complaint I have is that some tracks are just underwhelming when compared to the highs on this album, but I really, really, really like Aladdin Sane.
Yeah, I went with Heroes. And as much as I love Low, its direct follow-up Heroes is just, personally, it takes a lot of the aspects that I really liked about Low and just makes them even more complete and stunning. And although I admit I don't prefer this album by a big margin, I think they're both pretty much equally great. It just has to be my pick over the two. I think the cherry on top of the cake when it comes to Heroes is just the sheer quality of a lot of the ambient tracks on the back end of this thing. They're absolutely mesmerizing. A lot of them seem to, for me personally, take a lot of inspiration from Berlin School, which is quite fitting considering, you know, it's the Berlin trilogy. But that sound, you know, that kind of reminds me of groups like Ashra, or even a bit of Kraftwerk in a way. It certainly adds a lot of charm and just a lot of beauty to this album. The instrumental tracks particularly are just blow me away. And then there's the non-instrumental tracks, which include Heroes, and I don't think I need to say much more than that. It's probably one of the best tracks ever released by anyone ever. It's one of my favorite Bowie tracks, and that's saying something considering how many breathtaking tracks he has. But yeah, this album is just fantastic, and it's pretty much on par with Low. If I had to pick one, I'd pick Heroes, though.
Alright. My favourite tracks from Aladdin Sane are Watch That Man, Aladdin Sane, Cracked Actor, Time and Lady Grinning Soul. My least favourite track is a bit of a hot take, Panic in Detroit. I know that's a beloved Bowie song for a lot of people, but like I think it's great, don't get me wrong, but I wouldn't put it as the best. I had to do it to him.
My favourite tracks on Heroes were Heroes, Sons of the Silent Age, Blackout, V2 Schneider, Sense of Doubt, Moss Garden, and New Cullen. My least favourite track was Joe the Lion.
We're in the top 5 now. The cream of the crop of Bowie's discog. And yep. I'm excited for this one because this was so fucking tough. You don't understand. So, for my number 5 pick, actually an album that I thought I'd have at my number 1, I chose Low.
Oh. Want to hear something spicy?
Oh shit, here we go.
My number 5 pick is Lodger.
Damn!
My favorite of the Berlin trilogy.
The best in the Berlin trilogy. Wow.
Yeah, that's the spicy take that I was waiting to hear.
That is the spicy take. Okay. I didn't expect that one. Now I expected something else, but like, damn, Lodger best in the Berlin trilogy.
Yep.
That's actually pretty fucking funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, Low. You know, the first album in the Berlin trilogy, the first album he worked on with the one and only Brian Eno, and in my opinion, it's one of his best albums. I think Bowie and Eno really bring out the best in each other on this album, as this album sees Bowie take a newer and more experimental approach to his sound. It was unlike anything in his discography up to this point, and I couldn't imagine what it was like hearing this when it came out, as this is just otherworldly. You know, this album is split into 2 sides. On the first side, we essentially get a set of abstract art rock and art pop songs that feature these very like subtle yet encapsulating performances from Bowie, and these like subtle complexities and details in its mixes. And Bowie himself is like more of an instrument on this album in a sense, and he manages to create something that, you know, is catchy despite how challenging they may seem at first. And, you know, on the second side, we get a bunch of like abstract, ambient, electronic pieces which are very sparse, very dissonant, and, you know, at times apocalyptic, especially Warsaw. You know, every track on this album is amazing to me. When I first heard it, I wasn't sure about what I was even listening to, and I wasn't sure why I liked it, but the more I listened to it, the more I realized how well crafted, at times gorgeous and timeless this record sounds. You know, not to mention, this record is very influential. It would go on to, you know, it would actually go on to influence some amazing artists, some of my favorite, like the likes of Joy Division, Nine Inch Nails, Vangelis, and The Cure, just to name a few. So, yeah, I really, really like Low.
I'll scream it from the rooftops. Lodger is criminally underrated. You know, even though it's part of the Berlin trilogy, it is a bit of an anomaly when it comes to that trilogy. It doesn't really have that much in common with the more meticulous and atmospheric Heroes and Low. It's very vibrant and eclectic album, and one that's full to the brim with just one exciting track after another. I can see why a more accessible album immediately following two very experimental projects may turn some people away from Lodger, but to me personally, just the energy of this album and the variety of world music influences make the colourful nature of this album just really, really enjoyable, and one of the just most fun album listening experiences I've ever had was listening to this project for the first time. It's just, if literally the album name is very suitable, it does feel like a journey through like different genres and different influences, and everything is brought together perfectly.
All right. My favorite tracks from Low are Warsaw, Subterraneans, Breaking Glass, Be My Wife, Sound and Vision, and Art Decade. I don't have any least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks on Lodger were Fantastic Voyage, African Night Flight, Move On, Red Sails, DJ, Look Back in Anger, Repetition, and Red Money. My least favorite track is The Assassin.
My number 4 pick is Station to Station.
My number 4 pick is Black Star.
Okay, Station to Station was made during a very dark time in Bowie's career, as, you know, he was living off of the infamous diet of red peppers, milk, and cocaine. He was going through a nasty addiction to cocaine at the time, and it heavily influenced what he was doing on Station to Station, especially with the character on this album, the Thin White Duke, which, to me, is Bowie's darkest character. Like, he's described as someone who's just emotionless and who could write them, like, the most beautiful love songs with absolutely no love behind them, and that's easy to notice given like Bowie's performances, as he sounds cold throughout this album. Like, he sounds very ghostly, especially with the darker moments, and there's just something so alluring about like this character and what it tries to do, and it might just be my favorite character Bowie has done. But not to mention, this album just sounds amazing. It is phenomenal from front to back. It sees Bowie go through so many styles and sounds with each track, yet it seems so cohesive, and it's only 6 tracks long, for fuck's sake, with some of his longest songs, yet it feels so perfectly paced. You know, Bowie toys with lots of sounds on here: art rock, soul, funk, and even disco on the title track. It's so dense and layered with interesting nuances that it's insane, and I love listening to it. Plus, it's some of David Bowie's best vocal performances are on this album, especially on Wild Is the Wind. And it's just such a fine release from Bowie, and it may not be my favourite album from him, but it is certainly one of my favourites.
Yeah, my number 4 pick was Black Star. I'm not sure where to even begin with explaining why Black Star is a special album. Also, I might add that everything above this is a 9, this included. You know, up until his death, Bowie was a visionary and an artist to the core. And even in his final moments, he had to give off one last artistic hurrah in this album. And Black Star definitely delivers. You know, even if you were to ignore the meaning and story behind this album and just, you know, face it as just an album isolated with no, you know, knowledge of the artist or who's behind it, it's still an incredible album. It's still brilliant. It's sophisticated. It's just spectacular. But, you know, there are a lot of dark and retrospective moments on this album, and those said moments are made even more gut-wrenching and just undeniably intense by the fact that David Bowie passed 2 days after this album was released. It's just a final kind of swan song from David Bowie, and it's perfect. It's perfect in that sense.
Yeah. My favourite tracks from Station to Station are Golden Years, Stay, and the title track. I have no least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks on Black Star were Black Star, 'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore, Lazarus, Sue, or In a Season of Crime, Dollar Days, I Can't Give Everything Away. I do not have any of these favourite tracks.
Yeah. Okay, we're in the top 3 now. And, woo. My number 3 pick is Heroes.
My number 3 pick is Station to Station.
Heroes is the second installment in the Berlin trilogy, and it's my favourite one personally. It's actually the first Bowie vinyl I got. I got it a few weeks ago. It sounds amazing. And I think Heroes shares a lot in common with Low, and normally I'd find this a little derivative, but in all honesty, it doesn't really feel that derivative for me. I think that Low is just I think Heroes is just as gratifying as Low, and to me, it's the most gratifying experience in the Berlin trilogy. You know, there's two sides to this album. The front is just art rock and art pop tracks, while the second half is just mostly ambient pieces, and they sound incredible. The production on this album is stellar. The way that the rock instrumentation blends with the synths sound gorgeous, to say the least. There's some fantastic instrumentation on every single track, and as a result, we get a tracklist filled with some of the finest material I've ever heard in an album setting. Hell, I even think the ambient tracks on here are better than the ones on Low. And that's not to take away from those ones, because those ones are amazing on their own, but I don't know what it is about the ones on this album in particular. They're just, I don't know, entrancing. You know, Bowie is on fire on some of these performances. He kept his performances to a subtle place on Low, but on Heroes he doesn't do that. He just goes all out, and he just sings his ass off with pure charisma and passion. And Jesus, some of his most passionate tracks are on this album, like Blackout, Beauty and the Beast, and Heroes. Like, Heroes, honestly, it's my favourite David Bowie song, no denying that. It's one of the best songs I've ever heard. It might even be my favourite song of all time, because it's just so fine and gratifying. You know, at first the songwriting didn't intrigue me, but I felt more captivated with what Bowie was saying, especially on the opener in Heroes. Sure, you could argue he plays it a little safe on Heroes, and it's not as surreal and as otherworldly as Low, but to me Heroes is almost like the enjoying life and fun version of that, and I hold it highly in his discography because of that.
Yeah, I went with Station to Station, and to me it's definitely one of the more darker and more intricate Bowie albums, and to me personally it's one of the most all-around complete David Bowie albums. It takes some of the blue-eyed soul aspects established on Young Americans and expands them into 6 brilliant and captivating tracks. The instrumentation here is just the standout factor to me. It's very nocturnal and dense. It's also very pleasant, and you know, Bowie's performances add that cold and introspective feeling to the album that I mentioned, and the whole album is just tied together perfectly in its feel and aesthetic. It really doesn't have any weak tracks at all. It just stays consistently strong. It stays consistently engaging, and its highs are just some of the best highs in Bowie's entire career. And as a whole, it's one of the most consistent albums in his whole career as well.
Alright. My favourite tracks are Heroes, Beauty and the Beast, Sons of the Silent Age, New Cologne, and Moss Garden. I don't have any least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks on Station to Station were Station to Station, Golden Years, Words on a Wing, and Stay, and I do not have any least favourite tracks.
Number 2. Hush. My number 2 pick is The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars.
My number 2 pick is also The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars.
Yo! Ah yes, Ziggy Stardust. The most popular and iconic album in David Bowie's discography. And for good reason, it's an amazing album. To start, I think that the production is fantastic. From start to finish, we're given very theatrical and grandiose instrumentals that feature some incredibly catchy instrumentation, very impressive guitar and bass work. The bass work especially is really sticky. I should actually take the time to learn some. And Bowie complements these instrumentals fantastically with some amazing performances, great vocals, memorable hooks, larger-than-life sounds, and of course, the songwriting is tight, it's concise, and flawless to me, especially with the loose concept of, you know, the dying Earth, the Ziggy Stardust, and 5 years left. And it's, you know, it's kind of cheesy in that, like, in that sense, but I'm an absolute fucking whore for the sci-fi inspired concepts, so I love it. And I admire how tight the writing is and how this story matched together with the larger-than-life and theatrical instrumentation, as well as Bowie's dramatic vocals. And, like, this album to me is, like, a definitive, like, glam rock album. If there was an album that, like, I'd have to say perfectly describes what glam rock is, then The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust would be that album. And I think it's a near flawless record in Bowie's discography. I think there's so much about it that makes me hold it in high regard. It has some iconic and incredible tracks, and it deserves all the praise that it gets. And yeah, overall, amazing album.
Yeah, while it's not my personal number 1 pick, there's just no way you can deny how iconic and amazing this album is, and there's no way I can possibly just like look away from the fact that this is probably his most acclaimed album and his most famous album and his most iconic album. And I do kind of see why. It's for very good reason, and a lot of the sentiments that a lot of people have about this album I share. It is the pinnacle of glam rock, and in a lot of ways it represents David Bowie as an artist more so than anything he's ever done. The concept is cohesive and entertaining, and the songwriting is great. The performances are just incredibly iconic. The instrumentation is very tight, very intricate, and very interesting. The whole album is just explosive and glamorous, and just an absolute just sonic masterpiece. It's just the fact that there is one particular album that I know most people will not agree with me, but it's just so near and dear to my heart that I just could not put it anywhere but number one. Any other artist discography, I think this would be a shoe-in for number one, but there's just one Bowie album that I just adore more than words can describe.
There's one album I also adore more than words can describe. But with that being said, my favourite tracks from the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust are 5 Years, Moon Age Daydream, Starman, Ziggy Stardust, Rock and Roll Suicide, Suffragette City, and Hang On To Yourself. I don't have any least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks on Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust are 5 Years, Soul Love, Moon Age Daydream, Starman, Ziggy Stardust, Rock and Roll Suicide, and It Ain't Easy. I do not have any favorites.
We made it to the number one. And my number one, my personal favourite David Bowie album is Black Star.
My favourite David Bowie album is Hunky Dory.
I remember you mentioning Hunky Dory as your favourite Bowie album ages ago.
Yeah,
so
nothing's
kind of
changed.
expected this. Yeah, shit, where do I even begin with this, man? Like, David Bowie's final album is an album that saw him tackle some of the darkest themes he ever faced, while also creating an interesting, refreshing, yet bleak sound. And, you know, I think I'll just start off by just going over the production. I think production-wise, this album goes for this kind of experimental jazz rock and synthetic jazz sound, and I think it's great. Every instrumental on this album sounds fantastic, all while adding this kind of haunting and chilling twist to it. What intrigued me the most about this sound is just how weird its combination of like being organic sounding and electronic and cold is just a weird thing to hear at first. It's jarring too, but to me it works. It sounds amazing. It sounds bigger and it sounds chilling. Like not a single bit of instrumentation like left me underwhelmed. It all just sounds so like right to me, so perfectly placed and well orchestrated. And you know, on its own, without the context of, you know, Bowie's passing, this is just an amazing album on its own. But like, of course, you know, what Bowie himself did on this album is just can't go understated. And it's impossible to even talk about this album without bringing up the fact that he passed away 2 days after this album came out. The themes that Bowie covers on here are by far his darkest. He reflects on his life and his inevitable death, which at the time he was looking right in the face. He was literally dying, and he knew what he was doing. The way that Bowie, you know, delivers the lyrics as well seems chilling to me. He sounds like a phantom, like he sounds like a ghost basically. He's like singing to us posthumously. And, you know, it's apparent with literally the opening lines from Lazarus. You know, the weariness and aged sounds of his vocals are a key part to how they impacted my listening experience, and he literally sounds like a ghost on this album. You know, and the way that I see it, Black Star is a parting gift to Bowie fans. It's Bowie's special way of saying goodbye to those that adored him and admired his legacy. It's his swan song. And Black Star just has so much to offer within its 7 tracks and 41 minutes of runtime. And it's a truly amazing album to me. It's honestly, it's become one of my favorite albums of all time. And I can't really say much else besides that because I'll be going on for hours.
Yeah, my favourite Bowie album was Hunky Dory, and it's the first David Bowie album that I ever fell in love with, and even after all these years, this album just hasn't lost any of its magic for me. Every time I listen to this album, I'm just transported and blown away. It's just such a mesmerising, exciting experience. Just so many tracks on here that are just incredible, just uniquely anthemic and just ahead of its time and just timeless, completely timeless. David Bowie's performances on this thing are at worst great, at best just jaw-dropping. It's got a perfect balance between glamorous and sophisticated and memorable. Everything about this is just exciting. There's not a single dull moment. It just feels very colourful and complete. And, you know, my two favourite Bowie songs are Life on Mars and Changes, and both of them are on this thing. So, yeah, it's just the Bowie album that I come back to the most often by far. Ziggy Stardust is not far behind, but there is no way I could justify putting this anywhere other than first place for me personally. It's a masterpiece.
Alright. My favourite tracks from Black Star are Black Star, 'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore, Lazarus, Girl Loves Me, Dollar Days, and I Can't Give Everything Away. I have no least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks on Hunky Dory were Changes, Oh You Pretty Things, Life on Mars, Cooks, Fill Your Heart, Andy Warhol, Song for Bob Dylan, and Queen Bitch.
We did it! We ranked every David Bowie album.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow, indeed. I thought this would be a longer episode, but we actually did it pretty well. I'm surprised.
Yeah, pat on the back for us.
I'm glad we got to cover such an iconic discography from an iconic artist.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's insane. And, well, I guess all that's really left to do now is the outro. So, with that in mind, thank you everybody for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. Who do you agree with the most? Who do you disagree with the most?
Yeah, please tell us.
Give us some of your favourite David Bowie albums. Let us know some of your favourite tracks from him. Be sure to check out our own individual channels. Be sure to check out our Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. And, yeah. With that being said, my name's MickyT.
And if you made it this far, comment 2021 hype. Woo!
2021 hype, let's go! We have big things planned, and we cannot wait to get them done, because it's going to be. I have a feeling this is going to be a great year for us. Well, for the podcast, I mean, not for the world in general.
Individual channels too. We've got good things planned. Maybe a collab.
Indeed.
Maybe.
Maybe. Something to do with the goat.
Oh, barnyard animals.
Of course, you know, all that shit.
Yeah.
So with that being said, I've been MickyT. This has been Nostalgia.
Woo!
Yep. See ya.
Peace.